What's the creepiest thing your toddler has ever said that made you realize she knew something she shouldn't? My daughter, Sophie, was 4 years old when she said something that made my blood run cold. We were eating breakfast on a Tuesday morning in our suburban kitchen. I was frantically packing her lunch for preschool, checking the weather on my phone, when she looked up from her cereal with those big blue eyes and said, "Mommy, why does Daddy hurt the ladies in the basement?" I nearly dropped the juice I was holding. The words hit me like a physical blow, echoing in my skull like a gunshot. "What did you say, honey?" She repeated it word for word, as if it were the most normal question in the world. Her little voice was so matter-of-fact, so innocent, just as other kids might ask why the sky is blue or where babies come from. My husband, Mark, had left on a business trip the night before, driving away in his immaculate sedan with a leather briefcase and pharmaceutical samples. He traveled constantly for his job, selling pharmaceuticals, he claimed. He was always gone 3 or 4 days at a time, attending hospitals and medical conferences all over the tri-state area. The basement was his workshop, strictly off-limits to Sophie and me. 2 years ago, he had installed a heavy-duty industrial lock, like the kind he had on a warehouse, claiming he kept expensive equipment there and didn't want thieves getting access to thousands of dollars worth of medical supplies. "Sophie, honey, Daddy doesn't hurt anyone." "Where did you hear that?" She bowed her head, genuinely confused by my startled reaction. Her blonde curls bounced as she moved, catching the morning sunlight streaming through our kitchen window. She was wearing her favorite purple dress with tiny unicorns on it. I heard them crying last night. The lady with the yellow hair was so scared. She kept saying, "Please," over and over again, like when I beg you for extra cookies. My hands started shaking uncontrollably. The coffee mug I was holding rattled across the counter. Mark was in the basement until almost midnight, claiming to be organizing inventory for his next business trip to Chicago. I could hear music playing through the floor. Classical music, which struck me as completely odd, since Mark hated anything that wasn't classic rock. He always said that classical music was pretentious garbage for people who thought they were better than everyone else. I assumed he used it to drown out the sound of his power tools, or maybe he was listening to something educational. "What lady, kid?" There weren't any ladies in our basement. Sophie stirred her cereal thoughtfully, the spoon making little clinking sounds on the ceramic bowl. She always ate her breakfast so neatly, never spilling a drop on her tablecloth. The one who looked just like the missing lady on TV, always asking for her mother and crying loudly. The missing lady on TV. My stomach dropped to the floor like a stone. For 3 weeks, every local news report had covered the disappearance of Jennifer Walsh, a 23-year-old student nurse with long blonde hair who looked remarkably young for her age. She had disappeared from the Mercy General parking lot after finishing her night shift. Her car was found unlocked, with her purse inside and the keys in the ignition. The entire community was on edge. Parents walked their students to their cars. The university had tripled its security patrols. "Sophie, you slept last night. You must have had a bad dream or seen something scary on TV." She shook her head firmly, her expression deadly serious, the way only children can be when they know adults don't believe them. "I wasn't sleeping, Mommy. I was very thirsty, so I went down to the kitchen to get some water. That's when I heard them making noise." "Them?" Her voice dropped to a whisper, and she glanced nervously at the basement door, as if she were afraid someone would overhear our conversation. The crying ladies. There was more than one of them now. Dad had a lot of them down there, and they were all very sad. I couldn't breathe. The kitchen seemed to be spinning around me in slow motion. It had to be a coincidence. A child's overactive imagination, fed by too much news, but Sophie had never been the type to make up complicated stories or lie about anything. She was practical, literal, observant, like her father. She noticed details other children missed and remembered conversations word for word. Then she said something that changed everything forever. Dad saw me listening at the door. He got really angry and grabbed my arm hard. He said if I ever told anyone about the ladies, something really bad would happen to you. The juice fell from my numb fingers. The apple juice splashed onto the linoleum, making a sticky puddle. Sophie looked at the mess with genuine concern. "Are you okay, Mommy?" "You look really pale." Somehow, I managed to clean up the spill and get Sophie ready for school, thinking all the while. I helped her into her little pink backpack, made sure she had lunch money, and kissed her goodbye like it was any other day. But nothing would ever be any other day. I dropped her off at Little Scholars in a daze, barely able to acknowledge Mrs. Patterson's cheerful morning greeting. I registered her presence mechanically, watching the other parents chatter about weekend plans and birthdays. Their lives seemed so simple, so innocent. Back home, I stood at the basement door for the first time in months. Mark had made it clear that his workspace was private. "I need one space in this house that's mine alone," he'd said when I'd asked if I could help him organize it. "You have the whole upstairs, the kitchen, the living room. Can I have one space?" The heavy lock gleamed silver against the dark wood. I tried to remember when exactly he'd installed it. It was right after our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had had a break-in last spring. There had been 3 burglaries in our neighborhood in the space of a month. "Just being on the safe side," he explained. "You can't be too careful these days. Crime is on the rise everywhere." I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. Silence. But then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like fingernails on wood. And was that a muffled sob? A soft, desperate sound that made my skin crawl. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. I backed away from the door, nearly tripping over the laundry basket I'd left at the bottom of the stairs. It was insane. I was letting a 4-year-old's fantasy ruin my marriage, my sanity, my entire sense of reality. Mark was a pharmaceutical sales representative. He had awards hanging in his upstairs office. Salesman of the Year 3 times in a row. He gave presentations on new drugs to doctors and nurses. He brought back photos from medical conferences where he'd shaken hands with hospital administrators and drug executives. Doctors and nurses like Jennifer Walsh. I'd spent the day obsessively cleaning, trying to distract myself from the growing terror in my chest. Every creak in the house made me jump. When the washing machine shifted during the spin cycle, I almost screamed. I scrubbed the kitchen countertops until my hands were raw and bleeding. I'd moved the pantry twice and vacuumed the living room carpet so many times I could see the marks in the pile. But I couldn't stop thinking about Sophie's words, the absolute certainty in her voice, the way she glanced nervously at the basement door, the fear in her eyes. When Mark called at lunchtime to check in, as he always did when he was traveling, his voice had sounded different, more strained. "How's everyone at home?" he'd asked. "Okay, Sophie's at school. I'm just cleaning." Okay. Nothing out of the ordinary is going on." I almost told him about Sophie's comment. I almost asked him point blank if there was anything I should know, but something in his tone stopped me. "No, nothing out of the ordinary." "When will you be home?" "Thursday night, like always." "I love you. I love you too." But when I hung up, I realized I wasn't so sure anymore. I started thinking about our relationship differently. How Mark always knew where I was, who I was talking to, what I was spending my money on. How he gradually convinced me to quit my job, to stop hanging out with my friends, to rely entirely on him. How he controlled our phone bills, our internet usage, even my social media accounts. He did it as if he cared, protected me. Now it seemed sinister. I remembered how he'd reacted when I'd suggested going to work when Sophie started kindergarten. "We don't need the money," he'd said. "Sophie needs her mom at home. What if there's an emergency at school?" When I'd mentioned missing my work friends, he'd point out how much more time we had together now. When I wanted to visit my sister more often, he reminded me how expensive gas was. He systematically isolated me from everyone and everything that might give me independence or an outside perspective. When I picked Sophie up from school, I studied her face for signs that she was being taught or making things up. But she chatted happily about finger painting and reading. Perfectly normal, except that she avoided looking at the basement door when we came in. "Tell me more about what you heard last night," I said as we sat at the kitchen table with her afternoon snack of apple slices and goldfish crackers. She took a careful bite of her apple, lost in thought. The lady with the yellow hair kept saying, "Please, and I want to go home." She sounded just like me when I have a bad dream and I want you to come cuddle with me. "What else did you hear?" There were banging sounds like someone was hitting the walls and chains rattling. Chains? My blood turned to ice. "What chains?" "Like the ones on my swing, but bigger and they moved a lot." "What else?" There was a lady with dark hair who wasn't making any sounds anymore. My hands clenched into fists. "What do you mean she wasn't making any sounds?" "She was just lying there really quietly, like when Grandpa slept at his funeral. but her eyes were open and she looked really sad. I excused myself and ran to the bathroom, where I threw up until my stomach was completely empty. When I came back, Sophie was still eating her snack, humming a song to herself. I called my sister Rebecca that evening under the guise of asking about her weekend plans. But really, I needed to hear a normal voice to ground me in reality. "You sound weird," she said right away. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Just tired, Sarah. We've been sisters for 32 years. Don't lie to me. You sound completely terrified." I almost told her everything. The words were right there, ready to spill out like water from a broken dam. But then I imagined trying to explain that my 4-year-old daughter had claimed there were kidnapped women in our basement. Rebecca would think I'd had a complete breakdown. She'd probably call Mark herself, worried about my mental state. "I'm fine." "Really? Just dealing with stress." "What stress, Mark? Is Sophie okay?" "You're scaring me." "It's okay. I just think I might get sick." You know how paranoid I am when I start anything. After I hung up, I realized that I hadn't actually been sick for over a year. Mark was very particular about hygiene, vitamins, and preventative care. He controlled everything I ate, everything Sophie ate. He said it was because he understood the importance of health better than most people, having worked in the pharmaceutical industry for so long. I also realized that I hadn't actually worked since Sophie was born 4 years ago. Mark insisted that we didn't need the money, that his salary was more than enough for our comfortable lifestyle. He gradually convinced me to quit my job at the marketing firm, saying that Sophie needed a full-time mother at home. When did that happen? When had I become so dependent on him for everything? My old colleagues had stopped calling after I'd turned down their invitations so many times. My university friends had drifted apart when I'd stopped replying to their texts about girls' nights out and weekend getaways. Even my family had stopped calling after Mark had expressed concern about how much large gatherings were affecting me. That night, I waited until Sophie was asleep, then crept downstairs with a flashlight. The scratching sound was louder now, more desperate and frantic. I could hear muffled sobs and what sounded like chains clanking against metal. There was definitely more than one voice. At least 3 distinct cries for help. Someone was definitely being held against their will. Many. I ran back upstairs and called 911, whispering into the phone that I thought someone might be locked in my basement. The dispatcher asked if I was in immediate danger, and I said, "I don't think so, but please hurry." She said officers would be there within 10 minutes and asked me to stay on the line. As I waited, hiding in the bedroom closet with the phone pressed to my ear, I heard Mark's car pull into the driveway. The sound of the engine was unmistakable. His sedan had a slight rattling sound that he had been meaning to fix for months. He wasn't due back until Thursday night. I rushed to the bedroom window and watched him get out of his sedan, checking his phone repeatedly. Had he somehow traced my call? He insisted on managing all of our technology, including our phone plan and internet service. He said it was easier to have everything under one account, that it saved money and simplified billing. I thought he was being practical. Now I wondered what else he was tracking. Our location, our conversations, our internet searches. The front door opened and his voice carried up the stairs, unnaturally casual. "Sarah, I'm home early. Finished meetings earlier than planned." I heard something under his casual tone. Suspicion, fatigue, the voice of a predator who senses danger approaching. "I'm upstairs," I called, trying to sound normal while whispering to the 911 dispatcher that my husband had just arrived home unexpectedly. "Just getting ready for bed." I heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow and measured. Each creak of the old wooden steps seemed to echo through the house like a countdown. When he appeared in the doorway of our bedroom, his eyes were cold. Not the warm brown I fell in love with 8 years ago, but something predatory and calculating. "Where is Sophie?" "Asleep." She had a long day at school. Art class and games on the playground had tired her out. He came closer, and that's when I noticed his clothes were dirty. His usually immaculate shirt had dark stains, and there was something dark caked under his fingernails. Something that looked distinctly like dried blood. "You look nervous," he said, studying my face like a scientist examining a sample under a microscope. "Just tired. A long day with Sophie. You know how 4-year-olds are, Sarah?" His voice dropped to a whisper that gave me goosebumps. "You were in the basement?" My mouth went dry as a desert. "Of course not. You know I don't go there." You made that very clear years ago. Good. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile he used on difficult clients. All superficial charm with nothing genuine behind it. Because if you were, we'd have a very serious problem. The doorbell rang. Mark's face went completely white, then red with rage. Are you waiting for someone? Before I could answer, a voice came from the porch. The police. We'd received a call about a possible emergency. Mark grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin so hard they left bruises that lasted for weeks. I watched the fury build in his eyes, like a storm gathering strength. What have you done? Nothing. I didn't do it. If you've ruined this, he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath hot on my cheek. I'll make sure you disappear like the others. And then I'll take Sophie somewhere you'll never find her. The officers knocked again, more insistently, and Mark released my hand and straightened his shirt, instantly transforming back into the charming salesman. It was terrifying how quickly he could switch personalities, like flipping a switch. Stay here. Don't say a word. If you make a sound, I'll kill them, and then I'll kill you. I listened as he came downstairs and opened the door. His voice was smooth, friendly, the same voice that had convinced me to marry him, to trust him with my life and the safety of our daughter. Officers, I think there has been a mistake. My wife has been having some mental health issues lately, postpartum depression that never fully resolved after our daughter was born. She has been hearing things, seeing things that aren't there. In fact, sir, the call was about someone locked in your basement. A long pause. I could almost hear Mark's mind racing, calculating his next move, like a chess player thinking several moves ahead. This is very strange. Our basement is unoccupied. It's just a storage area for my work materials. I'm a sales representative for a pharmaceutical company. Would you like to take a look? Yes, sir, if that's okay. I crept to the top of the stairs and watched Mark lead the two officers to the basement door. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys, and I could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Sorry, it's been locked in for months. Company policy on storing controlled substances. I keep thousands of dollars worth of expensive pharmaceutical samples in there. Insurance claims, you understand. The lock clicked. As soon as the door opened, the smell hit them like a physical wall. Even from above, I could smell it. A sweet smell that made my stomach churn violently. Death, decay, human waste, horror, the smell of suffering. One of the officers immediately radioed for backup and an ambulance. His voice was urgent and professional. We need multiple units and an ambulance to 1247 Maple Street. Possible kidnapping situation. Multiple victims. Send a forensics team and a medical examiner. Sir, I need you to step away from the door and put your hands up where I can see them. There must have been some kind of mistake. Hands are visible. Step away from the door. Now, I have credentials. I am a respected member of this community. I sell life-saving medications to hospitals across 3 states. I have awards. I have recommendations, sir. Hands are visible. Don't make me ask again. The second officer was already calling for forensics and a medical examiner. I heard him say, multiple victims and immediate medical attention and possible crime scene. Mark was handcuffed on our lawn as more police cars arrived, their red and blue lights painting our suburban street eerie colors. Neighbors came out to watch, their faces shocked and horrified. I saw Mrs. Henderson next door cover her mouth in disbelief. Across the street, the Johnsons hugged their teenage daughter tightly, as if they had suddenly realized that monsters could live anywhere. The next few hours were a blur of overwhelming activity. More police arrived in a seemingly endless stream. Forensics officers with cameras and evidence bags. The medical examiner and his team. FBI agents in dark suits. I watched from the living room window as they carried out 2 black body bags and 1 woman, barely alive, strapped to a stretcher with IVs hooked up. Jennifer Walsh was found chained to the wall in what Mark had converted into a soundproof cell. She was dehydrated, traumatized, and barely conscious, but breathing. She had been there for 3 weeks, surviving on minimal water and scraps of food that Mark threw her when he remembered. The other 2 had been there much longer, months. They died of trauma, infection, and deliberate neglect. Mark kept detailed diaries of each victim, documenting their deterioration with clinical detachment. Detective Morrison, a kind-faced woman in her 50s with graying hair and gentle eyes, sat with me in my kitchen as they examined the crime scene. She spoke with the authority of someone who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, but she was also compassionate. Your husband has been charged with kidnapping, aggravated assault, murder, and federal offenses related to transporting victims across state lines, she said softly. We'll need to talk to Sophie about what she saw and heard, but we have specially trained staff who work with children. She's only 4. She doesn't understand any of this. I know our child psychologist will make sure she doesn't get further trauma, but her testimony could be critical to convicting your husband and perhaps saving other lives. How many? I asked, my voice barely audible. How many what? How many women were there? How many did he kill? Detective Morrison's expression darkened. We've found evidence of at least 7 other victims over the past 3 years. We're still processing the scene, but we think there may be more. Many more. 7 other victims. Women who had families, friends, careers, dreams, futures stolen from them. Women who simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind heartbroken families who never knew what happened to their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. Your daughter saved Jennifer Walsh's life. The detective continued. The medical examiner says, if you hadn't called then, she wouldn't have lasted another 24 hours. Her body was shutting down. Sophie spent the next week with my sister Rebecca and her family while our house was processed like a crime scene. Yellow tape surrounded our property like a pollution barrier. News vans parked on our street for days. Reporters knocked on doors constantly, trying to get statements from neighbors about the Maple Street monster. The local news was relentless. Our wedding photo was on every news channel. High school yearbook photos of the victims, timeline graphics showing when each woman disappeared, expert commentary on serial killers and how they hide in plain sight. When Sophie returned home, she seemed remarkably normal, but I immediately booked her in with Dr. Chen, a child psychologist who specializes in trauma recovery. Children her age often don't understand the gravity of what they're seeing. Dr. Chen explained during one of our first meetings. This may actually protect them psychologically. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't understand the true horror of what was happening in your basement. She knew she needed to tell someone. Dr. Chen continued, children have incredibly strong danger instincts. Even when they can't explain why something feels wrong, Sophie's natural honesty and trust in you has saved several lives. The investigation revealed the full scope of Mark's crimes over the next several months. He used his job as a pharmaceutical representative as the perfect cover for his operations, targeting victims in hospitals across 3 states. He would identify women working night shifts, study their routines for weeks or even months, and then abduct them from secluded parking lots. His sales territory gave him the perfect excuse to travel and be away from home for extended periods without arousing suspicion. The FBI found a detailed journal in his car detailing each victim, their names, ages, physical descriptions, work schedules, home addresses, marital status, personal habits, fears. He kept photographs of them before and after the abductions, trophies of each crime. The man I shared a bed with for 8 years, the man I trusted with my child, was a methodical, calculating monster who had been planning this for years. They also found evidence that he planned to expand his operations significantly. He had bought property in 2 other states under false names, isolated farmhouses where he could keep more victims without any chance of detection. He studied soundproofing techniques, security systems, and disposal methods. Your call that night stopped what could have been one of the worst serial killings in American history, Detective Morrison told me months later. He was escalating rapidly and had the resources and knowledge to continue for years without detection. The trial lasted 8 months and completely dominated the local news. Mark's defense desperately tried to claim that I had planted evidence, that I was having an affair, and that I wanted to frame him for crimes I had committed. They portrayed me as an unstable housewife, jealous of her husband's success and business trips, suffering from severe mental illness and delusions. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about postpartum depression, false memory syndrome, and the possibility that I had orchestrated the whole thing to gain sympathy and attention. They suggested that Sophie had been coached to lie, that a 4-year-old's testimony could not be trusted. But the forensic evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. DNA evidence linked Mark to all the victims. The basement was soundproofed and rigged with handcuffs, chains, surveillance equipment, and torture devices. Hospital parking lot video showed his car nearby when several of the women went missing. Cell phone records placed him in those locations during the presumed times of the abductions. Most damning of all were his own diaries, written in his distinctive handwriting, documenting every detail of his crimes with clinical precision. During victim impact statements, Jennifer Walsh's mother stood in court and thanked Sophie by name, her voice breaking with emotion. "This little girl found her voice when my daughter couldn't find hers," she said through tears. She spoke for all the women who couldn't speak for themselves. "This is the reason my daughter is alive today, and the reason this monster will never hurt anyone again." Families of other victims also spoke. Parents who wondered for years what happened to their daughters. Siblings who never stopped searching. Children who grew up without their mothers. The courtroom was filled with grief, rage, and gratitude that the nightmare was finally over. Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. He showed no remorse during his sentencing, staring straight ahead with dead eyes, as if he were completely disconnected from reality. He never looked at me during the entire trial, but I heard from other inmates' families that he asked about our new address and threatened what he would do when he got out. We moved across the country after the trial was over. I used the money from the sale of the house after a thorough cleaning and renovation to get rid of all traces of what happened there, to start over in Oregon, as far away from this nightmare as possible. The house sold for well below market value. Even after a professional crime scene cleanup and a complete renovation, buyers were reluctant to purchase a house where such horrors had taken place. Eventually, a developer bought it, completely tore it down, and built a new house on top of it. But everyone in the neighborhood still knows what happened. Sophie is now 8 years old and has no memory of that night or what she told me. A trauma specialist said that children often forget traumatic events as a defense mechanism, especially when they are very young. Her mind protected her from the full horror of what she saw. She's in 3rd grade now, loves soccer and art class, and still has the same literal, practical view of the world that saved Jennifer Walsh's life. She notices things other kids miss. When her teacher lost her wedding ring at school, Sophie found it in the sand on the playground where no one else thought to look. When our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, fell in her garden and couldn't get up, Sophie was the only one who noticed her from our kitchen window and immediately told me. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't listened to her. If I had dismissed her words as fantasy or a bad dream, the way so many adults dismiss childhood fears as insignificant, how many more women would have disappeared into that basement? How many more families would have been torn apart? Last month, Detective Morrison called to say they had linked Mark to 6 other missing persons cases before he came to our state. A student nurse in Ohio who had disappeared 2 years before we met, a hospital administrator in Pennsylvania, a pharmacy technician in West Virginia, a medical records clerk in Kentucky, 2 more women from different states whose cases had gone cold years ago. The investigation is ongoing, and they believe there may be more victims they have not yet identified. Your daughter may have prevented dozens of other kidnappings and murders. She said it escalated rapidly. The time between kidnappings was getting shorter, and the violence was getting more brutal. If he hadn't been caught then, we might have one of the worst cases of serial killing in modern history. When I told Sophie she was a hero, she just shrugged in her usual businesslike manner, the same way she might have responded to being told she'd done well on a spelling test. I was just telling the truth, Mom. That's what you do when something's wrong. She paused, then added thoughtfully, adults don't always listen to kids when they say important things. But you did. That's the difference. That night, I put her to bed in our new house, a house with no basement, no locks I didn't have the keys to, and windows that actually opened. Every door in our house could be opened from both sides. I checked them obsessively every night before bed, testing each lock and knob multiple times. Good night, my brave girl, I whispered, kissing her forehead and inhaling the sweet scent of her shampoo. Good night, Mommy. I love you. As I turned out the light, she added softly, I'm glad the crying women don't live with us anymore. I hope there's somewhere safe where no one can hurt them. She rolled over and went to sleep, leaving me standing in the doorway of her room with tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed with gratitude for her courage and honesty. Jennifer Walsh writes to us occasionally. She's back in nursing school, pursuing a degree in victim advocacy and trauma counseling. She says she wants to help other survivors find their voice and recover from their experiences, just as Sophie helped her find the strength to survive. In her most recent letter, she included a photo of herself at graduation. She was smiling, surrounded by her family, looking healthy and strong. At the bottom, she wrote, "Thank you for listening to the little voice that saved my life. Sophie will always be my hero." Other families stay in touch too. We've gotten Christmas cards from Jennifer's parents, birthday cards for Sophie from the Walsh family. They created a foundation in honor of all the victims, focusing on improving hospital safety and supporting the families of missing people. Sometimes, late at night, when Sophie is sleeping peacefully in her bed, I think about all the women who are gone. All the voices that were silenced before they were heard. All the families who are still broken, still grieving, still searching for answers. But then I think about Jennifer Walsh, who is alive and helping others heal. I think about all the women who are not gone because Sophie had the courage to speak up. I think about all the monsters who can be caught because parents listen more closely to their children. Sometimes the most important words come from the smallest voices. You just have to be willing to hear them. And when you do, you might just save.